Hey nerds. So, I'm going to talk about the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason again here. Of course, the famous 18th century Enlightenment philosopher. And I'm going to talk about his position on knowledge or epistemology, transcendence versus transcendentalism that I mentioned before in terms of metaphysics, rationalism and empiricism in terms of epistemology as well. And going to get into a little bit of Kant's opinion on metaphysics because it's in relation to the way he looks at epistemology or knowledge and why he sees they're connected. And also, basically, a few of the key figures in rationalism and empiricism, along with what they are. So, obviously, Descartes, one of the most well known fathers of rationalism, and John Locke, of course, one of the most well-known figures in empiricism, different ways of looking at how we arrive at facts about reality, basically, you could say. Okay, so here, from part of the book, let's get into Kant's argument for metaphysics. And, oh, of course, I forgot to say that Descartes, of course, 17th century, and John Locke, 17th century as well. Okay, so the metaphysical deduction is officially titled The Clue to the Discovery of All Pure Concepts of the Understanding. The clue to the his deduction about metaphysics is the clue to the discovery of all pure concepts of understanding. In it, the metaphysical deduction, Kant is concerned with the concepts that are fundamental to all knowledge and so are called categories. Fundamental pure concepts of all knowledge, or fundamental pure categories of all knowledge. As his title suggests, he makes two claims. One is to have identified the categories systematically and hence exhaustively. So he claims to have systematically and exhaustively identified the pure concepts or categories, the pure fundamental concepts of all knowledge. So the other is his second claim is that he has shown that they are pure concepts and indeed that they are merely intellectual, having their origins solely in the understanding. I think that's the most crucial aspect of this part here, that they are merely intellectual and having their origin solely in the understanding. This is why metaphysics is related to epistemology in terms of Kant's views, because, like he's saying there, even though he's saying that these are the pure fundamental concepts and categories of all knowledge, they're merely intellectual. So you could say that the most pure fundamental concepts of all reality and knowledge are real, but they don't physically exist. They only exist intellectually and / or metaphysically, you could probably say. So the most pure concepts of reality are merely intellectual concepts. They don't physically exist. So if we're talking about the concepts behind knowledge, this is how Kant's views on metaphysics are connected to his views on epistemology, right? So that's why it's key to explain his thoughts on metaphysics, at least briefly, before we get into his epistemology. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So, of course, metaphysics, to oversimplify, is the study of the nature, structure, and function of reality. And it can include theological concepts like God, but it can be like metaphysics is also kind of related to physics, like what constructs all of reality, how is it built, how is it organized, what causes it to be, is there something that causes it to be, that sort of thing, right? So we're going to get into his more of his thoughts on epistemology here in terms of transcendence versus transcendentalism and rationalism versus empiricism. Okay, so Kant obtained the very idea of a priori knowledge from the rationalists, although he introduced his key distinction between analytic and synthetic a priori judgment. So remember, if we go back to Descartes, one of the most famous rationalists, of course. He had he divided knowledge into a priori and a posteriori knowledge. This idea for a priori knowledge, meaning that it's just necessarily true and doesn't have to be proved or justified in any way, which is why a priori claims are fundamentally flawed, in my opinion. And a posteriori means that you've proved them through reason and argument and evidence, that sort of thing. And so Kant, of course, as we've talked about many times before when we've gone through Kant, he split knowledge into a priori. He split a prioris into analytic a prioris and synthetic a prioris. So synthetic are even more just like completely artificial statements that are just assumed to be true. And you could say that analytic, these are kind of oversimplifications, but analytic is more of like an observation of something that is true rather than like you could say that like if I understand correctly that wall is white, that might be an analytical a priori judgment, or actually no, maybe it would be something more like there are words in books, that sort of thing, like more of an analytical statement. And synthetic a priori could be something like all Christians are good, like the most artificial of a priori claims that you can possibly think of. All Christians are good, all atheists are good, all atheists are bad, all Christians are bad, etc., etc., right? all all left wing people are bad, all right wing people are bad, all left wing people are good, all right wing people are good, etc. So those are something like a synthetic a priori judgment. So of course, like of course we mentioned that Kant got a priori from not necessarily Descartes, but from rationalism in general. So Descartes split knowledge into a priori and a posteriori knowledge, or rationalists did, and then Kant further split the a priori knowledge into analytic a priori statements and a priori statements, or analytic a priori claims and synthetic a priori claims. So he introduces key distinction between analytic and synthetic a priori judgment, on which more shortly in criticism of them. And another philosopher argued that Kant obtained the idea of a deduction of key categories and principles from the empiricists. So that's interesting too. So Kant was highly critical of both rationalists and empiricists, I should say. One of the most famous seminal Enlightenment philosophers. He had some very stupid opinions, very good opinions, very interesting opinions. Most of them are interesting, even though some of them are dumb, but his thoughts are so detailed that so many philosophers have commented on them that it's always worth getting into his work along with other philosophers' comments on him and analyses and criticisms, etc. So Kant obtained the idea of deduction of key categories and principles from empiricists. So, of course, like rationalism, basically meaning that it's this foundationalist approach to knowledge, that everything can be rationally explained, that, and what the foundation that this rests on, for if you're Descartes, it's I think, therefore I am. This means I know that I think about whether I exist or not, and the fact that I'm even thinking about it is proof that I exist. And then, of course, he goes through proofs of these to try to see whether this is wrong. And basically, his dumbest argument that he uses to choose to believe that he is actually existing rather than that he's just assuming it is that it's possible that an evil god could be deceiving him into believing that he exists. but that a God wouldn't do that. So that's really stupid, right? It's possible that an evil God could be deceiving him into exist, but God can't be evil, so God isn't doing that, so therefore I think, so therefore I exist. You see how he has sloppy logic? But there are definitely virtues to rationalism, of course, but that whole I think, therefore I am thing is stupid. Anyway, John Locke, of course, rather than rationalism, believing that you can learn all you can know about all you need to know about reality through, you know, rational judgment and reason and all that kind of great stuff that that atheists like Sam Harris love. And then there are empiricists like that of John Locke who believe that basically we derive all knowledge from our senses and our observations of reality. So, of course, our five key senses are sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. This is how we learn all of reality through that way. But obviously, this is fundamentally flawed too, because we know that we evolved to not accurately process all information around us, so we wouldn't be distracted by a blade of grass when there's a lion lurking behind some bushes 5 feet away, so we can just react without instinctively without thinking and just run that way. So we can't trust our perceptions. It doesn't neither of these criticisms of rationalism or empiricism mean that we can't know anything, of course, but it means that if you're using rationalism or empiricism to say that this is the only way we can learn everything we can possibly know about reality, then that's obviously wrong. And Kant was right in criticizing them, although it is actually interesting that in his criticism he uses rationalist and empiricist assumptions to come to his conclusions about his criticisms of them, but he also builds on their categories. Like, of course, in this example, he splits rationalists a priori versus a posteriori. In He splits the a priori of those into analytic a prioris and synthetic a prioris. So he's criticizing rationalism while building on it. And he's using a rationalistic reason to criticize rationalism while building on it. And that's also what he's doing with empiricism. But it's cool when philosophers do that. That's why philosophy is so fascinating. Okay. So Descartes got his deduction of key categories and principles from the empiricists. Although, again, he introduced the key distinction. So, of course, just like he did with rationalism, he criticized empiricism also, but he used an empiricist reason to criticize empiricism, and in thus doing so, also built on empiricism too and improved it, arguably. And the same with rationalism, I would say. Okay, so although he again introduced the key distinction between physiological or empirical and transcendental deductions in criticism of them. So if he's talking about empirical deductions, he splits the rational a prioris and a posteriores. I don't know why I'm being inconsistent with pronunciation. The rational a prioris and a posteriores into analytic and synthetic a prioris. He also splits the empiricist deductions into physiological deductions, empirical deductions, and transcendental deductions. So again, of course, just we've mentioned transcendentalism before, which Kant came up with. And just to oversimplify, I would say that transcendentalism is almost like more transcendent than transcendent. Transcendence, of course, you can look to the famous ancient Greek philosopher Plato. We're talking about transcendence. Like, let's say he believed in this realm of form, so it doesn't have to be in the sense in terms of God if we're talking about it. But you could say God is transcendent, God is above us, but still possible to be accessed, perhaps. You could say that in Plato's realm of forms where there's the perfect ideal of everything, there's a perfect ideal of a chair, and that is the transcendent realm of forms. So you can access it. We can perhaps never even access a perfect chair, but we can, like, well, maybe not access, maybe we can't even create a perfect chair, but it's possible. Like, we can interact with the idea of it in the same way that if God is transcendent, we can interact with God in some sort of spiritual way, according to Plato or something, you could say. So, and then transcendental is like more transcendent than transcendent in a way, so that you could say that this idea of the perfect chair is not just above perception. It doesn't just transcend perception, it goes above the level of perception that transcendent is. So, like, more transcendent than transcendent. So if a chair or a god is transcendental, it means that it's so high above our perception that it's impossible for us to ever interact with it in any way, shape, or form. That's, again, that's an oversimplification, but that's what you could say transcendentalism is to Kant. Okay, so again, Kant introduced the key distinction in empirical deductions between physiological empirical deductions, empirical deductions, transcendental deductions, and in criticism of them. So we split empiricism into further categories and build out the theory in the process of criticizing it, which is interesting too. Right. So yeah, that's why I thought that's all interesting. Of course, that Kant's metaphysics is very crucial to his understanding of epistemology, and he talks about how these categories that he invents can transcend the concepts of space and time. So if we're talking about transcendental categories, but it's not actually a transcendental category, it's an empirical transcendental category, right? So yeah, it's very interesting that he that he uses these, he criticizes these concepts, but in doing so, he builds them out and adds to them and makes them stronger, basically. It's really interesting when philosophers do that. Anyway, yeah. So it's interesting that Kant's views on metaphysics mean that the way he looks at categories mean that categories can be real, metaphysical, or even perhaps merely intellectual concepts, but they still exist. So we can talk about metaphysical or intellectual concepts that are still key to understanding knowledge and reality. So that's why these intellectual concepts like a priori and a posteriori and synthetic and analytic a prioris and physiological and empirical and transcendental deductions, that's why they're all connected. And in creating these further subdivisions of the categories, Kant creates brilliant criticisms of them by pointing out the flaws, but he also makes it stronger and offers valid criticisms, but also makes their position stronger in the process. So it builds in the philosophy, so you can critique each other and build out your theories. And of course, I've mentioned many times before that people didn't respond well to Kant. People were ruthless with Kant. Don't be a Kant. Because philosophers are super fucking petty, just like all intellectuals, just like all people. Remember, I've explained before that they reinterpret someone else's word and redefine it in order to suit them and take down that interpretation, like really disingenuous, or they'll criticize it and then flip it on its head and say this is the way it should be, so that's why it's good rather than bad, or bad rather than good. And they're all petty and insulting each other and saying they can't say what 1 + 1 is, they can't do math, like really petty insults like that. But yeah, anyway, Kant is interesting. And one of my favorite philosophers, of course, Slavoj Žižek, has said some very favorable things about Kant, but also he has some great criticisms of it. And yeah, Kant is a very interesting figure. He's definitely not all he's cracked up to be, but he's not bullshit. He contributed greatly to philosophy, regardless of what you think of him. So he's worth studying, especially in terms of other philosophers' opinions on him. Anyway, yeah, Kant is very complex and fascinating, as pretty much always.